Okay. Before I start talking, I would like to thank Marina again for inviting me for this panel. And as you know, we're here to give our opinion on the subject of diversity. That's exactly what I understood. Or rather, maybe question this basic concept in terms of how it's being used in setting up new agendas in art and culture. But before I ask these questions and focus on some concerns, I would like to briefly interject the 6-year-long case study of Sidestreets, an independently run project by my partner and me, which has put into action hundreds of programs on art and culture in the form of seminars, exhibitions, film screenings, workshops, educational programs, and so on, all of which concentrate mainly on audience building, awareness raising, and promotion of quality works, where a good number of them concentrate on subjects which are rooted in or related to Cyprus, but transformed into more critical and global concerns in their form and capacity. To give you one example, a couple of years ago, we had a research project which manifested itself in a book, exhibitions, and seminars. The project was called The Lost Mosaic Wall from Expo 58 to Cyprus. Here, the project started with a small fragment, somehow found in Cyprus, of a mosaic wall made in 1958 by a prominent Turkish artist. A few things got our attention before we even started researching. Not only that nobody knew how the fragment got here, even in the Turkish art history books, this was mentioned as a lost work. But also that this 2 by 2 meters fragment was actually part of a 200 by 2 meter long wall from the World Exposition in Brussels in 1958. For us, the fact that this was a wall, which has considerable metaphoric meaning, especially in Cyprus today, and it was made of mosaic, which has a long artistic tradition of Roman and Byzantine cultures, in addition to the unknown fact of how and why it came to Cyprus around the time of the establishment of the Republic of Cyprus, became a curiosity for us. The excitement was not only to find the rest of such an enormous artwork, but also to look at its implications in the socio-political and historical context of Cyprus. The cultural significance of the findings was even more surprising and transformative in terms of understanding how cultural products not only trace our histories, but also embody memories which are significant in writing alternative histories for the future. Sidestreets project, in its conception, focuses on the ideas of central and on the side, and it ironically positions itself in more than one way, including physically, as the Sidestreets building located on the main street to challenge this position. Keeping in mind the current positioning of Cypriotness, to be within a society and at the same time not to be, creates a special challenge where the audience constantly lingers between yourself and the possible other, but hardly ever you call either of these positions a society which recognizes common culture, aspirations, or interests. Globally, in recent decades, there has been a stronger and faster transition in visual culture, where the art object has become more of an idea, the monumental has become more ephemeral, centers have been dispersed, and the Euro-American aesthetic has been challenged by more national or ethnically based folkloric visual cultures. While global travel and migration are changing demographies and the cultural mix in societies, countries and institutions are developing new policies to cope with the new challenges and find answers to the questions of what gets to be preserved, how art and education should be managed in order to tag in the new ideologies and what kind of identity to promote, how new situations can become beneficial for a new economic and cultural politics, and so on. Within this framework, each development comes with a new terminology to draw attention to these challenges, as it defines itself only to find out that the set terminology keeps becoming inept and not adequate for the current ideologies to be fulfilled. This is why at one time the term multiculturalism was promoted by American-Canadian policies and adopted by many others, but then the actions to promote multiculturalism proved to be problematic, as it actually ended up being more of an idea of assimilation of cultures by the dominant one. This awareness started to raise the other issues beyond questions of minority rights, such as the right to preserve one's culture, regardless of gender, ethnicity, or nationalism, and so the new term interculturalism and diversity have become popular in defining new cultural politics. Either way, both diversity and multiculturalism cannot escape from becoming commodities to be consumed, especially as art mechanisms become larger and are in need of more and more state and institutional fundings. So what role does art play in this context? Or rather, how do these mechanisms, curatorial institutions, biennials, state legislations, or grant mechanisms in general, perceive and promote art and culture? Does the preservation of certain products as something specific to certain people promote racism or nationalism? How do we handle diversity in teaching or in the creative process? There are no clear ways to resist or avoid falling into this kind of constantly changing terminology and focus, and you can try and set up an art or culture of resistance. But at the same time, there is also a need to think about local artistic and cultural development in terms of how it can intersect or engage with the structures and mechanisms which are imposed on others by dominant cultures. The reason for this is so that it can also be assessed and hold its own within these frameworks on a global, international, or at least humanistic level. Every culture has its own peripheries and its dynamics in its development. This is environmental, intellectual, and spiritual all at once. Therefore, my only suggestion is actually to research for artistic and cultural products and producers, and not simply to accept them as statements of political messages, but to bring in new, transformative readings and critiques while formulating the ideal rather than the ideological. So what do we mean by the ideal? Although artistic production on the island of Cyprus has a long tradition, each community claims specific threads of island's multiple histories as their identity and therefore preserves them. These claims of identity are based on ideological selection and exclusion. For various reasons, including official indoctrination through the education systems, monumentalization of past traumas by carving the words "I will not forget" in stone in public spaces, and the oral transmission of bitterness against the other from generation to generation. Endless narratives are written that base constructed identities on selective memories, nationalism, motherlands, ethnicities, and belief systems. So far, it has been inconceivable in Cyprus to base one's identity purely on what surrounds its people as a whole. A rich historical and cultural environment that is much more human and much more interesting, containing interactions of diverse cultures which are not necessarily coherent or indoctrinated and may even be a bit schizophrenic in a positive sense. Considering that this has been the understanding of Cyprus, how can cultural production or identity be built on diversity? What methodologies should be adopted in education and cultural policies for such a concept? The challenge here is not only to maintain the existing cultures, but to raise awareness of historical, social, and cultural challenges and promote production of all kinds independently. In other words, changing the framework of how we think of our boundaries and how to expand and look for quality instead of following a path which we do not question, just mindlessly accepting being ideologically dominated. Rereading the cultures that exist and have existed in Cyprus throughout history can challenge the current cultural politics for policies far beyond Cyprus. Today, diversity may be brought in as a new term to be followed, but the irony is that diversity has been the unrecognized condition which has already existed in Cyprus and in many other parts of the world. Yet the promotion of the term today not only gives power to it, but it also allows us to reread our own cultural histories and recognize the logic of their power structures with this concept. Clearly, in the last decades, cultural production has been very much supported by various national and international bodies, such as private institutions, the EU and the UNDP, etc., especially as so-called bicommunal projects. Within these frameworks, artistic and cultural products and events which adhere to promoting something called Cypriotness, supposedly based on finding similarities exclusively between two communities on the island, have been promoted with the agenda of helping reconciliation, which fits into the policies of these frameworks. As such, bi-communal projects have been produced to serve such agendas, and these events have become a tool for propaganda rather than artistic projects, which could propose ways of rereading the situation in a broader and more transformative way. While these activities have served a purpose, they have done this only in a very limited way to have not contributed substantially to intellectual history of Cypriot culture. In conclusion, speaking of art and diversity, the world art market system may have a few decades before they come up with a refreshed term to replace diversity with a more democratic word. And this will go on. I cannot see rejection as a resistance for this, but there is a value in the awareness and transformation of its use by recognizing what we may be forgetting or ignoring while adapting a term which is imported. As a matter of fact, if we understand diversity as a kind of boundaryless identity building, as reflecting cultural richness with no exclusivity, and as something fundamentally human and humanistic, then in a few decades we may have something to say to refresh terminology of culture, of cultural politics and policies and art. Thank you.